The title of this teaching is Life in the War Zone, Spiritual Warfare in the Old and New Testaments. Really, we can just think of what we'll be doing for the next hour or so together as introducing the topic of spiritual warfare and tracing some of the main themes that relate to spiritual warfare, first in the Old Testament and then secondly in the New Testament. Before we get there, I just want to kind of do an introduction to our introduction. Say a little bit about why I am teaching about this topic, how I got interested in it, why I think it's a serious topic of absolute importance for the Christian faith. And then say a little bit of word about on balance, which is a really important theme when we're dealing with the topic of spiritual warfare. So first, a little background on myself and this topic. I grew up in the church. If you would have asked me at any point, probably in the first 20 years of my life, do you believe in demons? I would have probably said, yeah, I believe in demons. And if someone said, why? I probably would have said, well, Jesus believed in them. You know, I believe in the Bible, and Jesus seems to have cast out demons quite a bit in the Bible. So yeah, I'm sure there's such things as demons. And it would have stopped about right there for me. It would have had absolutely no practical relevance in my life. It would have been a purely theoretical belief because the Bible tells me so. And then at age 22, that changed for me. I had just come back to a relationship with Jesus after kind of walking away from him for a number of years. And maybe a year into that kind of rejuvenated relationship with Christ, I ended up in an office of a pastor who was praying for me one day. And to make an hour and a half story a little bit shorter, the pastor began to pray for me about any darkness in my life, any elements that the enemy might have got a hold of during those years that I was having nothing to do with God. And long story short, as he began to pray around that and actually speak to me, to free me of anything that might have been there, my body began to do things I wasn't telling it to do. It was probably the most bizarre hour and a half of my life. He would start telling the darkness to leave me, and my head started shaking no, while and inside I'm thinking yes, 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 and my head's shaking no. He's went to put his hand on me to put hands on me and pray, and as he did so, my head dodged him. It was a crazy hour and a half. What I know is, at the end of the hour and a half, something snapped. And when I walked out of that office, I felt very different. My life looked quite different after that. Some areas of my life that have been very difficult, I just have to say, some areas of my life that were bondages, where I just felt in bondage to some things, I experienced liberation. And as strange as the hour and a half was, the life that followed that for the next several weeks was very beautiful as I began to live in some freedom that I really had never experienced before. So that got my attention. From that day forward, I've never been able to have merely a theoretical belief about this stuff. It became super practical for me. Fast forward a few years, I'm in seminary at this point now in my life. I'm actually writing a paper on Satan, trying to learn more about this. And lo and behold, I meet a guy named Greg Boyd. He came as a guest speaker to our seminary class one day. He and I ended up talking in the parking lot. We got to know each other. And within a few conversations, we found out that both of us had experiences in this area, and that both of us deeply believed that this is an important part of the Christian life, but that in a lot of the churches we were moving in and other Christian circles in the Twin Cities, there didn't seem to be a lot of balanced conversation on this topic. And so really Greg and my early friendship formed around conversation on this and related issues. Since that time, Greg's produced one of the best books, perhaps the best book I've ever seen, summarizing the Old and New Testament materials on spiritual warfare. It's his book, God at War, the Bible and Spiritual Conflict. A lot of what I'll be sharing today, it draws from this book. I had the honor of helping Greg do research for this book back in the day. So that's a really key moment, was when Greg put some of our thoughts down on paper that pull Woodland Hills theology together on this topic. Then in 1996, Greg and I started team teaching a course called God, Evil, and Spiritual Warfare every year at Bethel University, and it's still going on. And a lot of our thought has been shaped around that course together over the 20 years we've done that. More recently, I was involved in a book, an editor for a book called Understanding Spiritual Warfare, 4 Views. And we have 4 different contributors who have a little bit different takes on spiritual warfare, kind of giving their approach and then dialoguing and debating with each other. Greg's one of our contributors in the book. So Greg, that book offers Greg another place to kind of lay out a Woodland Hills sort of perspective on this. And I mentioned some of these books to say this. When it comes to balance, finding balance on this topic in terms of good resource material is often difficult. So I'll just say, of the many books I've seen on this, at the top of my list in terms of a balanced biblical presentation are Greg's book, God at War, a book by Dean Sherman called Spiritual Warfare for Every Christian. Dean's a longtime YWAM leader. A book by Tom White called The Believer's Guide to Spiritual Warfare, another pretty balanced book. And I think that our 4 Views book that I helped put together also helps bring some balance by showing the different perspectives and kind of helping someone wrestle through what does a balanced view of spiritual warfare look like. So finding balanced resources, that's one challenge. I think an even greater challenge in balance is finding balance in your own personal life, in my personal life. C.S. Lewis put it this way. This is in his famous book, Screwtape Letters, which I also have on my list of really good resources on this topic. Lewis says this: there are 2 equal and opposite errors that human beings can hold when thinking about Satan and demons. Two basically different but opposite errors. One error, he says, is not to believe in these things. The other error, he says, is to believe so strongly in them that one begins to get obsessed with them and imbalanced with that belief. And I think that's very, very accurate. Lewis named the 2 problems. Lack of belief, or believing so strongly that one begins to lose focus on Jesus and the power of God and begins to either get so obsessed with them or so fearful with Satan and demons that one sort of just backs away and doesn't actually engage in a biblically balanced mode of spiritual warfare. So to remember Lewis's call to balance is absolutely essential when it comes to this topic. Now, of course, we live in a culture that's a bit schizophrenic on this topic of believing in demons or believing in Satan. It turns out that most human cultures, in most times and places, have believed in spirit beings. There was one sociologist who studied all known human cultures that she could have access to and found out that 74% of them believed in spirit possession. And an even higher number would, of course, believe just in the existence of these things. But 3/4 of human cultures believe that humans can actually be demonized or possessed by these spirits. In our American culture, at least in the last major survey I saw done on this, which was the 2005 Baylor University research study on religion in America, found that 75% of Americans believe in Satan, believe in the existence of Satan. And 73% said that they believe in the existence of demons. So the majority of people in our culture do believe that these things exist and are in our world. But here's the question. How do we move from just a belief that this is true kind of like I used to believe theoretically, to an actual belief that transforms how we live our lives. A belief that we don't get imbalanced on, don't get fearful or obsessive, but that shapes the way we live and think such that we live as kingdom warriors, doing warfare in the ways that Jesus did. That's, I think, the challenge for us in this topic. It's one thing to say we believe in something. It's another thing to act as if we actually do believe in that. So what I'd like to do in this particular session is kind of break it into two parts. First, what are some major spiritual warfare motifs or themes in the Old Testament? And then we'll move to a look at the New Testament. Just kind of break the teaching up into two parts with our two main sections of our Bibles, the Old and the New Testament. So let's talk about what do we find in the 39 books of the Old Testament when it comes to things around spiritual warfare. One might expect that if you want to learn or kind of see what something says about spiritual warfare, one's going to look for words like demon or evil spirit or Satan, right? It's natural. That's the language we use when we tend to talk about evil powers in the world. What's interesting, maybe initially a little disturbing, is that when you turn to the Old Testament, you don't find much mention of the word that we would translate into English demon or evil spirit or even Satan. Less than 10 times in the entire 39 books of the Old Testament is the phrase evil spirit used. Less than 10 times. Only 4 times, I think, if I remember the exact count, only 4 times is the word used that we would translate demon. And when it comes to Satan, in the entire Old Testament, only 3 passages contain the word Satan. In fact, in 2 of the 3 passages, it isn't Satan, it's the Satan. It's an actual title of a being, not a personal name. Those passages would be Job chapters 1 and 2, the largest section of the 3. And then there's a couple verses in Zechariah chapter 3. And finally, there's one verse in 1 Chronicles 21 that mentions Satan as a proper name. That's it for the entire Old Testament. So one could conclude that, wow, the Old Testament doesn't talk much about spiritual warfare. I don't think that would be true, but that could be what we're led to conclude if all we're looking for in spiritual warfare is talk of Satan, demons, or evil spirits. Now, of course, you might be thinking, well, aren't there other sort of more indirect ways the Old Testament talks about evil spirits? For example, what about the serpent in the garden, right? A figure representing Satan, perhaps. And yes, there are other what you might call indirect ways, where it's not using the name Satan, but might be referring to something that we as Christians would point to and saying, well, that's representing Satan in the Old Testament. And that's true. So it would be the serpent in the garden would be one of those things. In fact, the book of Revelation in the New Testament, our last book, chapter 12, says that the serpent of old, the one in the garden, is Satan. So it's really because of our New Testament book, the book of Revelation, that we as Christians can make that correlation. Then there's a couple passages in the Old Testament. There's Isaiah 14 that talks about this morning star. This basically a very beautiful, powerful angel that was once good, but it eventually fell, decided to rebel against the true God, Yahweh God, and was cast out of heaven. Similarly, in Ezekiel 28, a very similar passage where it talks about a guardian cherub, which of course is a type of angel, that was beautiful and walked in the presence of God, but wickedness was found in his heart, and he was put out of the presence of God and out of heaven. And these passages have generally been looked at by Christians through the centuries as referring to what we today would call Satan. And I think there's some legitimacy there. We have to remember that probably the ancient author wouldn't have thought Satan because that name hadn't really been revealed yet in that point in history. But clearly there's some evil agent that's being represented here. And I think we legitimately can say that perhaps we can learn some things about Satan and his kingdom from passages like this. But at that point, at least if you're looking for things that we're used to talking about, Satan, demons, evil spirits, the serpent, that kind of exhausts the list in the Old Testament right there. There doesn't seem to be a lot more, at least not to the first glance. But what I'd like to do is look at a few other ways that we might consider seeing spiritual warfare in the Old Testament in new and different places we might not have identified before from our cultural lens. But trying to imagine in that culture of the ancient Near East, what might they have been trying to tell us with their language is something involving evil forces in the world that God is having to contend with. To begin that, I'd just like to start with Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Let's make it chapter 3 too. So the creation narrative, Genesis 1 to 3. How about the second verse of the Bible? We know many people are sort of familiar with the first verse, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right? The opening to our Bible. The next verse is interesting. And the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. So 4 different terms get used there that we translate into English as formless, void, darkness, and the deep. And as Greg has suggested, has done a really nice job of pointing out in his book, God at War, these 4 terms or ideas would have signaled to ancient people something is not right here. So in the very second verse of our Bibles, it's legitimate for us to notice there's ways that things are being expressed that can signal something is amiss in the world with regard to forces of evil. Now, if you just jump ahead 27 more verses to chapter 1 of Genesis, verse 28, we also can pick a little hint. You can kind of look at these as a series of hints that something is not perfect in this world. And you put all these hints together and a picture begins to emerge here. The second hint is when God creates humans. And the first job description he gives to us as humans is this. God said, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it." Subdue the earth. Now that word subdue literally comes from a Hebraic word that means to step upon the neck of something. Kind of an enemy that one is treading under your feet. You're putting them down beneath your feet. You're trampling on them. It's certainly a warfare-like term. Why would God tell us that our first job is to subdue or to tread down upon the earth? Well, that might make sense if there's some things going on in this earth that are not of God, that do need to be subdued, evil powers that do need to be tread upon, to have victory over. And of course, that's exactly what we find as the theme of spiritual warfare unfolds through Scripture. Third interesting hint, next chapter, chapter 2 of Genesis, verse 15. It says that God took Adam, placed him in the garden, and here was his command to Adam: cultivate and guard the garden. In our English translations, you might find the phrase to cultivate and keep the garden. That's a common way of translating it. But the word that we translate keep there, cultivate and keep the garden, is the Hebrew word shamar, which means to keep in the sense of keeping protected. Therefore, Greg and I would suggest a better translation is guard the garden. In fact, the very next chapter, chapter 3, near the end of that chapter, it says that God stationed an angel at the tree of life to shamar the way to the tree, so that Adam and Eve couldn't get back to the tree of life. And that we always translate as guard. So clearly the word guard in this context for this Genesis author, the word shamar, has a connotation of guarding against, protecting from evil forces or something that shouldn't be there. So our two basic job descriptions then were to subdue the earth and to guard the garden. And those, of course, the two things that Adam did not do. Because the next hint we see is a very strong hint. There's no ambiguity here. In chapter 3 of Genesis, a serpent comes into the garden, and Adam and Eve did not guard the garden. Instead, they enter into this conversation that eventually leads them into temptation, that leads them into sin, and to losing their authority over the garden. So the warning God gave them, the job description to subdue and guard, they failed in. A few things we can say about that disastrous chapter 3, that the fall of humanity, right? Really interesting to note Satan's tactics here. When Satan comes, he just asks a question. Isn't this how the enemy often works in our life? Not a frontal assault, but just little questions in our mind that the enemy can feed in. We don't even think they're enemy thoughts. They're just our thoughts. That's the challenge of how do we keep our brains off autopilot and actually pay attention. We'll talk more about this in this class of being detectives of our own mind, paying attention to our thoughts, and as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10, taking every thought captive to Jesus Christ. That's what didn't happen in the garden. As the serpent is offering this question that really is a lie. The enemy is always about deception. That's why Jesus calls him the father of lies. The heart of his program on earth isn't to, jump out and scare you at night in your bedroom. Weird things can happen, but that's not the enemy's primary tactic. His primary strategy in our lives is to present thoughts and habitual patterns of things in our mind that are just deceptive. They're just not true. And where he always starts is he starts by lying to us about who God is. If he can get in our brains a distorted picture of God, then it's not much of a jump to get us to have a distorted picture of ourselves and then of each other. And so like the garden, he starts with, did God really say not to eat of this fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Trying to paint this picture of God as sort of this pathetic, hyper-controlling being who doesn't want to share with the human beings. And of course, that was not God's heart. God's heart was, look, if you eat of this tree, you'll die. I love you. I want to preserve your life. The enemy paints it as God wanting to be a hyper-controlling tyrant. And instead of trusting God, our first parents trust the lie of the enemy. And we see where that led. Once that relationship with God was broken, everything else fell apart around it. Their relationship with each other, their relationship with their kids, even the relationship with the created world around them, the garden. All of that crumbled when they let go of their covenant love relationship with God, which is always grounded in our trust in God's character. If Jesus came to do nothing else, and he came to a lot, but at the center of Jesus' program was revealing to us who God really is. That's why Jesus says, when Philip asks him, Jesus, can you just show us the Father? Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. How can you then ask me, show me the Father? If you've seen my heart of love, you know what God's heart is towards you. So we see right in the first opening chapters of Genesis several hints and a fall, the fall of humanity, that tells us not all is right with this world. God is contending against evil powers. Now, these evil powers weren't there from the beginning, right? Once upon a time, there was only God. And as the Christian narrative goes, as we're kind of put Scripture together, we've realized God created angels at one point. Some remained faithful, some fell. The kingdom of darkness. Just like when God created humanity and we fell, and God is now working to redeem and to reconnect that relationship. And so there's always been, at least once God created and gave free will to creatures, there's always been some creatures that have chosen to remain faithful to God, or at least allow God to redeem them, and others that resist God's kingdom. Thus the two kingdoms, thus the spiritual battle. So, is this it? Is that all we have for spiritual warfare themes? Couple of mentions of Satan, couple on demons, few on evil spirits, and then a few hints in the opening chapters of Genesis. One might conclude, yeah, that's all we have. But again, here's the thing. We have to ask the question, how do we identify maybe other ways that the ancient Near Eastern culture in which the scriptures were written, how did they articulate, how did they talk about, how did they think about themes in spiritual warfare, maybe in ways differently from us? For example, if I asked you to imagine in your own mind, now just imagine Satan. Imagine Satan. Or what if I said, everyone take a piece of paper out, and if we supplied a box of crayons to everybody, and if I said, draw a picture of the devil for me. My guess is, if we did that exercise right now, many of you would draw very similar pictures, right? What would some of those things be? Probably you'd choose the color red to draw Satan and not green, maybe, right? Often he's pictured in our culture, whether it's cartoons or in movies or what have you, as kind of wearing a red suit. Probably you'd put some horns on him, right? That wouldn't be uncommon. That's a kind of a common idea. Satan has horns. Maybe you'd have a tail that has, it's pointed at the end. Common picture in our heads of what Satan looks like. Maybe you'd be holding a pitchfork, because that's a common cultural representation to us of how Satan looks. Now here's what's interesting, is if I said to you, okay, stop, do you really believe the actual Satan looks like that? Probably most of us would say, well, no, this is a cultural image that we use. It's sort of a pictorial shorthand that we use to sort of represent Satan. But no, probably really he doesn't look like that. Okay, so that helps us know that a culture can have ways of thinking or even talking about a power of evil where it doesn't literally mean that that's what the power is like, but rather there's something about the picture or the image that that kind of points to things that are true about Satan, right? Maybe it doesn't literally have horns, but why do we picture Satan with horns? Well, interestingly, a number of, whether it's the horns or the often has hoofs for feet, we often get that picture in our heads too. That comes from images of the Greek god Pan, one of the Greek gods that we kind of borrowed, our Western culture borrowed from, in order to create this pictorial image of Satan in our minds. Not literally do we believe that, but we use that as a cultural metaphor. The same is true for every culture when it talks about evil powers. So, the same is true for the Bible. The question I want to look at now are, what are some of the other cultural images the Bible, the Old Testament, uses to talk about evil cosmic powers that aren't familiar to us, that we would never pick up as representing that because we don't use those images to represent those sorts of things? Let's start with this one. This can be very surprising to us in the modern Western world. But one of the images or the ways of talking about cosmic evil, forces of darkness, in the Old Testament is using the idea of oceans or the sea or some body of water. For some reason, and I think we could probably imagine why, when you're living in that ancient world, and often you know that, say, a group of fishermen go out in their boat, and you see them go over the horizon, and what if the boat never comes back, as would often happen, whether they ran into a storm or who knows what, all of a sudden the ship just never comes back. In the ancient world, that was an uncommon phenomena, and they began to associate oceans with danger, and therefore there must be evil out there. So waters or oceans or seas or lakes even are oftentimes used in the Old Testament to represent evil forces. Let me give you a few examples. Psalm 74 says this, "You, Yahweh God, did divide the sea by thy strength, and you broke the heads of the sea monsters in the waters." So notice here, the sea is something God has to divide and conquer. And the waters have sea monsters in it. Now, whether they literally believe that, we don't know. But they're at the very least, imagining evil forces out there in the waters that they use now to talk about evil in their world. Much like we might use a picture of someone with horns and a red suit to talk about this reality of Satan. Or this verse in Job chapter 9. Job says, "Only God can walk upon and trample down the waves of the sea." Only Yahweh God can walk upon the sea. Because remember, to walk upon meant to have strength over and authority over, and therefore to have victory over. And Job says, only Yahweh God can do that. Nahum, prophet Nahum, chapter 1 says this, "Yahweh God rebukes the sea and makes it dry up." He dries up all the rivers. Now, it's not that Nahum had something against literal rivers. He liked water and wanted to have some to drink. But again, waters or rivers could represent, metaphorically, powers of evil, and that only God can deal with them and dry them up and make them go away. Now, it's helpful to know that, because one, when you turn to the Old Testament now, you see this theme all over the place. Just a different way of talking about evil powers that God is dealing with. Another dimension to this is what happens to the theme of waters in the New Testament. For example, when Jesus walks upon the waters of the Sea of Galilee, that is not just some cool miracle Jesus decided, like, gosh, what should I do today to show people I'm God? It wasn't that. Jesus knows that the Old Testament says, Job chapter 9, only Yahweh God can tread upon or walk upon the sea. What does Jesus do? He walks upon the sea. This is a strong indicator that Jesus is claiming for himself what is true about Yahweh God. Part of why we can see that Jesus was Yahweh God embodied. Or this phrase in Revelation chapter 21, very end of our Bible, right? It's describing the new heavens and the new earth. And one of the things it says is, in the new heavens and the new earth, there'll no longer be any seas. Now, I happen to be a beach guy and love the ocean. So I'm hoping that Revelation is talking metaphorically here about there'll no longer be any hostile forces that the Old Testament represents by seas. Personally, I hope there's a nice beach in heaven. But if not, I'm sure God will have that covered. But the theme here is picked up. And this idea of hostile forces presented as waters are done away with in the new heavens and the new earth. So waters, seas, oceans can often represent this in the Old Testament. We already mentioned, so can sea monsters, cosmic hostile monsters. For example, Leviathan. This is a creature we run into a number of times in the Old Testament, mentioned in the Old Testament. Isaiah 27 verse 1, for example. In that day, God will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, with his fierce and great and mighty sword, even Leviathan, the twisted serpent. He will kill the dragon living in the sea. So Isaiah uses the idea of sea monsters in the sea, or dragons in the sea, to describe God's power over evil. That in the same way someone could kill a sea monster, so God shall destroy and have victory over the powers of the enemy. Or Psalm 74, which we've already talked about, that God breaks the heads, notice plural heads, breaks the heads of the sea monsters, of the sea monster. It turns out that Leviathan, this cosmic beast, was often pictured as a multi-headed sea monster. Now again, did they literally believe that those existed? Maybe, maybe not, we don't know. Whether they did or not, they are clearly using that image to describe or represent evil forces in their world and how God will come against those forces and have victory over them. Spiritual warfare. In Job, chapter 41, there's an entire chapter-long description of this Leviathan. Some have said, in reading that, oh, that's just a crocodile. And it's like, no, it's not a crocodile. We're just told in these other passages that Leviathan is pictured as a dragon, often with multiple heads. So this isn't just a way of describing some natural creature. This is the ancient world way of describing hostile cosmic forces that God is actually having to engage. Another name for one of the sea monsters is Rahab. Literally means boisterous one. And we find this in Job, in some of the Psalms, in the book of Isaiah again, that talk about God defeating Rahab. Here's another theme, rebellious gods, small g, not a capital G. We have to remember this oftentimes when we're dealing particularly with the Old Testament, that the word God can mean one of two things. God either means the true God, like the creator God, there's only one God, but can also mean a powerful angel type of figure, a powerful spirit being. And there it would say that's a small g God. It's not a creator God because there's only one true God. But these are powerful spirit beings that God has given authority to. Read, for example, Psalm 82 sometime. Short psalm, but in it, it says that God, the true God, Yahweh, stands in the midst of the gods, the council of the gods, what we would call angels and high-ranking spirit beings. And God actually rebukes them. The true God rebukes these lesser spirit beings because they're not treating humans properly. They're oppressing humans. And God kind of warns them to wake up, guys, otherwise I'll have to bring judgment to you. So this theme in the Old Testament that also suggests spiritual warfare is this idea that some of the spirit beings that God created to serve him are no longer serving him, they're actually rebelling against him. So whether it's Psalm 82, or whether that's Daniel chapter 10, where we see a prince of Persia and a prince of Greece that appear to be demonic entities, some kind of demonic spirit being, and God, and particularly his angels, Michael the archangel, has to do warfare against them. Or the verse in Isaiah that says this, Isaiah 24, in that day the Lord will punish the powers in the heavens and the kings on the earth. Almost like there's a correlation between, if there's an evil nation on earth, there's a correlation with an evil spiritual power in heaven. Not the throne room of God, heaven, but somewhere in the heavenly realm, spirit beings that are kind of fueling and giving energy to the evil things going on down here on our planet. So these are just some of the themes that we can see in the Old Testament, some of which aren't real familiar to us as modern Western people, that show the Bible deeply committed to this notion that there's only one true God, only one creator, but when God created and gave free will to his creation, Some have chosen the path of following God's kingdom. Others have opted into another kingdom, the kingdom of darkness. We'll take a little break here, and we'll turn to New Testament in just a minute.